It's a Random Thought Thursday video. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a Random Thought Thursday video. This video was inspired by a video I saw made by Elle over at her channel, Elle Thinks, in which she was really just running down her reading for the last couple of months, I believe, or the beginning of 2023. And in that novel, in that video, she kind of mentioned that she'd been reading a lot of fantasy, particularly really enjoying the works of Robin Hobb. I know she's read the Farseer trilogy, and I believe the series she's working on now is the something of the Elderling. Sorry, my memory isn't working quite well there. And she was in the course of talking about these books, which she's really enjoying, and talking about how much she's enjoying reading fantasy. She kind of mentioned that the channels maybe in the part of booktube where my channel exists and her channel exists don't really read a lot of fantasy, and she mentioned that there seems to be this almost kind of snobbery. That's not what she said, that's my word, where literary readers have a tendency to look down perhaps on fantasy novels. And she defended them to a certain extent, saying, particularly with the work of Robin Hobb, that's quite literary in the writing, the way the characters are created, etc. And I found myself thinking, does this snobbery exist? And I think the answer is definitely yes. And then, where is that line between literary and fantasy? Where to draw that line? I think most people who read, that have read The Lord of the Rings, would probably classify The Lord of the Rings as literature, despite the fact that it is, epic fantasy. So there are probably some works of fantasy that people classify as literary or literature. By the way, all these classifications make me a little bit antsy, and I don't really like them very much. But there are people who classify it that way. But why do we draw that line in other places? So I started thinking about this, meeting point, this mesh point between literary works and fantasy works. And so I started trying to think of works that are definitely considered to be literary works, which are pretty close to being fantasy works. And so that led me to 100 Years of Solitude. Now, I didn't spend weeks thinking about this. The first one, or one of the first ones that came to mind, was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So I thought I would make this video almost completely unprepared, without having thought everything through. Make this video, put the thought out there, and see what you guys think. So I think you could argue that 100 Years of Solitude is actually a fantasy novel if we think about the elements of fantasy novel that we consider to be part of that genre, and we think about those in regard to 100 Years of Solitude. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware, or most of you are aware, that 100 Years of Solitude is considered to be kind of the seminal, or the one of the foundational works of magical realism, and that's what led me to kind of think about it in terms of fantasy. But if there are a few things we think about it being true with fantasy novels, I think a lot of those things are true also about 100 Years of Solitude. So one of the things I think that's true that we expect in a fantasy novel is world building. And there is world building in 100 Years of Solitude. Macondo is this community that's founded by the Buendia family, by a matriarch and patriarch who go there. That patriarch has a tendency to think about Macondo as almost being an island, even though it's not, being separate, and this place where they can have kids and generate this community and civilization kind of separate from the rest of the world. And in lots of ways it is, thus the name 100 Years of Solitude. And so there is definitely world building. We become acquainted with the geography of Macondo, and the people of Macondo, and the culture of Macondo, and the language of Macondo. And all these things are things that are part of the world building that Gabriel Garcia Marquez does in 100 Years of Solitude. So I think if we think about fantasy novels as novels that engage in world building, then 100 Years of Solitude, I think, definitely qualifies. So a second characteristic, I think, of fantasy novels, except maybe I should say, to clarify, like high fantasy novels, but in lots of other ways fantasy novels, is there's some kind of heroic character or some kind of heroic event taking place. Lord of the Rings are destroyed, the Broken Earth trilogy, the civilization, the system is broken down, evil is defeated, chosen one characters rise and carry out their destiny, that those kind of things happen. Now, this is a place where I'm not sure 100 Years of Solitude actually qualifies, but there are a lot of fairly heroic things that take place, whether it's an eating contest, whether it's Colonel Aureliano Buendia going off and fighting 32 civil wars against the conservative government of Colombia and losing all 32, fathering 17 sons by 17 different women that he all named after himself, the sons, not the women, and then all of them dying, and just kind of the epic scale on which I think 100 Years of Solitude is told. I think it comes pretty close to that idea of some kind of heroic actions, some kind of heroic characters existing. A third thing I think we associate with fantasy novels are fantastical creatures. Now, for the most part, I think that 100 Years of Solitude is free of fantastical creatures or other life forms or other things that aren't human. Like, there are no elves, there are no dwarves, there are no giants necessarily in 100 Years of Solitude. So I think in this case it doesn't necessarily work, but if I were to stretch as far as I could, I think we might compare the gypsy who brings all these scientific things, magnets and magnifying glasses and ice, Meliquades. I think we could make a connection between Meliquades and Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings books, that he, you know, brings special knowledge to this isolated community where he obviously likes to spend time, and he helps kind of bring them more into the modern world and perhaps solve problems, even though Meliquades things have a tendency to cause problems. But I admit there's a stretch there. And the last thing I have that's kind of a characteristic, I think, of fantasy novels that I think does exist for sure in 100 Years of Solitude are things happen in fantasy novels that don't happen in the real world. And this is where the magical realism of 100 Years of Solitude comes in, you know, that kind of foundational work, what we think about in the United States as that foundational work of magical realism, because things happen in 100 Years of Solitude that really don't happen. A beautiful young woman just rises into the sky and floats away. A man is surrounded and followed by a swarm of yellow butterflies wherever he goes. People live incredibly long lives. You know, a man lives tied to a tree for several years. All kinds of spirits and things like that inhabit the main house of the Buendias. There are things that happen that don't really happen in the real world. I do think there's an element of kind of a fantasy novel about that. Anyway, I did want to kind of talk about those four things and ask you, just for your opinion, you know, based on what I've said of 100 Years of Solitude, or if you've read it, do you think it qualifies as a fantasy novel? And if so, where is that line between a fantasy novel, which people who read literary works don't think about as literary, and a true literary work? I mean, Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize, and certainly 100 Years of Solitude is his most popular and influential book. I don't think there's any doubt that it is a literary work, but I do think it kind of fits this pattern or this idea we have of fantasy novels. And the last thing I wanted to point out and I wanted to think about is, or question you, is, do you think this division that we make, that people like me make, and that people of European descent make, is a product of European culture in which we insist on separating the fantastical from the real? I was thinking also when making this video about the works of Louise Erdrich and the works of other indigenous American writers who have a tendency to kind of incorporate spiritual, magical things into their otherwise realistic works and blend those two things together. Is it just Western civilization that insists the two things have to be separate and therefore creates these separate categories of fantasy versus literary novels? Anyway, like I said, this is a fairly unformed idea. Haven't thought it all the way through, but I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section, or even make your own video if you want to. Like I said, I look forward to your comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.